द वे फॉरवर्ड इज ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਸਾਡੀ ਅਡਾਪਟਡ ਕੰਟਰੀ ਹੈ ਔਰ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰੈਜ਼ੈਂਟ ਨੂੰ ਇੰਜੋਏ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਣੀ ਸਕਸੈਸਿਸ ਪਾਉਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਇਸ ਦੇ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਜਾਣਨਾ ਸਾਡੇ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਹੈ। ਅਸੀਂ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਦੇ ਪੋਲੀਟੀਕਲ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਨੂੰ ਜਾਣਨ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਉੱਥੇ ਹੀ ਇਸ ਕੰਟਰੀ ਦੇ ਸੋਸ਼ਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਫੈਬਰਿਕ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਡਿਵੈਲਪ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਜੋ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ 2022 ਵਿੱਚ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਉਹ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਡਿਵੈਲਪ ਹੋਇਆ, ਪਰਟੀਕੂਲਰਲੀ ਜਗ੍ਹਾਵਾਂ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਕਿ ਨਿਊਯਾਰਕ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਕਿ ਇਮੀਗ੍ਰੈਂਟਸ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡਾ ਇੱਕ ਇਨਫਲੂਐਂਸ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ। ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਪੋਲੀਟੀਕਲ ਸੋਸ਼ਲ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ, ਰਿਲੀਜਨ ਦੇ ਇਨਫਲੂਐਂਸ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਔਰ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਇਹ ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਨਿਊਯਾਰਕ ਬਣਿਆ। ਪਰਟੀਕੂਲਰਲੀ ਜਿਸ ਏਰੀਆ ਦੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨ ਲੱਗੇ ਹਾਂ ਅੱਜ ਉਹ ਹੈਗਾ ਲੌਂਗ ਆਈਲੈਂਡ ਦਾ। ਅੱਜ ਸਾਡੇ 'ਚ ਸ਼ਾਮਿਲ ਹਨ ਮਿਸਟਰ ਜੋ ਸ਼ਰੈਮ, ਜੋ ਕਿ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਕੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੇਖ ਕੇ ਪਤਾ ਚੱਲਦਾ ਹੈ, ਅਸੀਂ ਰਿਅਲਾਈਜ਼ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਵੱਡੇ ਸਕਾਲਰ ਔਰ ਇੱਕ ਹਿਸਟੋਰੀਅਨ ਹੈਗੇ। Otherwise, Mr. Joe Schramm is the director of film and television for the town of Huntington. ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਇੱਕ ਮਾਰਕੀਟਿੰਗ ਕੰਪਨੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਸ਼ਰੈਮ ਮਾਰਕੀਟਿੰਗ, which again deals with television marketing and all. Joe, thank you so much for taking all the time. You're most welcome on the Way Forward show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me today.
Joe, we always tell our viewers, we are the new kids on the block. We as Indians are, recent immigrants, and we are still learning about the society, the current, and it's very important to learn the history where you live. And not just the political history, the socio-religious, economic. And thank you so much for taking all the time and, guiding us, talking about this history today. We need your help. Tell us, we're particularly talking about Long Island today, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Specifically Long Island.
All right. So before we go into the details, I would like you to tell our viewers, what is it that we're going to talk about today?
Well, what we're going to talk about is a little bit about Long Island, what it is, where it's located, and how the role it's played in history of the New York metropolitan area. We're also going to talk about the earliest settlers who came and who they found here, the Native Americans who were already here for 1,000 years. We'll also go through a bit of the story of during the era of exploration and colonization by the Dutch and the British. And then we'll also talk about the earliest years of the United States of America. So from the Revolution, the American Revolution, all the way up till about the time of the Civil War, which is 1860s.
It's going to be a very interesting session, I'm sure. So let's begin. When does the story of Long Island begin?
Well, the original story of Long Island really begins with the Native Americans who were here. And so the Native Americans go back at least 1,000 years prior to the European settlers coming here. There are over 500 generations of Native Americans who lived here. And for the most part, the Native Americans who lived on Long Island belonged to an ethnicity, the Algonquins. And so they had a common language. There were very different dialects of it, of course, but they, much like English, which I speak a Long Island version of English. I certainly speak a different dialect than if I was from London. So the reality is that the Algonquin language was common to the peoples who lived in this area. And then within that Algonquin race, if we could call that, or ethnicity, there were different governments, and then there were different people who lived in different parts of Long Island.
So were there different tribes, or was there one particular tribe that lived there?
Well, there was much like I live in a town on Long Island called Northport, that I'm a North Porter. And so therefore, if you lived in New York City, you were a New Yorker. So very similarly, the Native Americans who lived on Long Island at the time belonged to 13 different communities in general that that historians have identified. And we know that from the names of our towns right now on Long Island. We have many towns that reflect the areas where, or the tribe, if that's what you want to call it, who lived in that particular area. So there were the Canarsies, and there's a section of Brooklyn called Canarsie. And there were the Rockaways, and that tribe lived in Queens, the Rockaways.
Okay.
And there are the Montaukets, and they lived in the area of Montauk, Long Island, the very end of the island.
We hear, a name called Lenape. So what's that?
Well, that's sort of the government. That was the, I much like I live on Long Island in a village called Northport. I live in the town of Huntington. I live in the state of New York. So they're levels of government. So the Lenape was basically the government. I mean, let's keep in mind that the Native Americans lived here for over 1,000 years before the Europeans came. So they had a currency, they had a government, they had a confederation, and that's what they called them. The Lenape was a confederation, and that confederation really went from Long Island west into New Jersey, Pennsylvania, modern day, and then up the Hudson River a little bit. Not all the way, because then you bordered with the Iroquois nation. So it was, Lenape were a nation. It was essentially the confederation. People traded together. They shared a common religion, common currency, and so much like modern day nations, you have different people living in different parts, and they belong to one country, or the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, on a much bigger spectrum, is like you have different people living in different areas, and they affiliate. Candidly, Long Island is about 120 miles long, and it goes from New York City, and then it proceeds going east about 120 miles. And so those tribes, or those people who lived closer to the western end of Long Island, were more involved and more related to the Lenape. So the two westernmost tribes, the Canarsies and the Rockaways, were more related to the Lenape because they were just closer. And as you got further out east on Long Island, there was less connection to that nation.
So we had a very structured society before the European settlers came in,
Sure.
of Native Americans, and then the Europeans show up. When is that? Around when?
Well, it's always arguable, but the first person to write about it and draw maps and tell us about it was Verizon in the 1500s,
1524, I think they say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And he went through the Narrows of New York, so that's why we have a bridge between Staten Island and Brooklyn called the Verizon Narrows Bridge. Now, he was Italian. He was an explorer from the Italian peninsula. Back in those days, of course, there was no nation of Italy. It was all these different principalities. But he did not. There wasn't an influx of people from Italy after that. Of course, Columbus came here, and he was Italian. But the fact is that that there was a gap. And it wasn't until like early 1600s, the first decade, that Hendrik Hudson came here, and he was really the beginning of settlement. So while Verrazano was an explorer, Henry Hudson brought settlement. That's what followed. And even though he was an Englishman, he sailed, for a Dutch company. And so that, as a result, it was that company that settled in the New York area. And it was called New Amsterdam, and it was Dutch.
You know, that's a very interesting history that we'll be learning from you today. We learned so far that there were these native people here, and around 1524, the first recorded exchange with the Europeans, between Europeans and the Native Americans happened. We will talk more about the settlements, the Dutch settlement, the British settlement, and how the present day Long Island evolved after a short break. ਅਸੀਂ ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟੀ ਜੀ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟੀ ਜੀ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ ਦ ਵੇ ਫਾਰਵਰਡ। ਦ ਵੇ ਫਾਰਵਰਡ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਲੌਂਗ ਆਈਲੈਂਡ ਦੀ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਦੀ, ਜਿੱਥੇ ਸਾਡੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਹੈ, ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਉੱਥੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਉਸ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਦੀ ਥੋੜ੍ਹੇ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਪਤਾ ਕਰੀਏ। ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਜੋ ਸ਼ਰੈਮ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ। So, Joe, you know, let's have a quick look at the Long Island map.
Sure.
Yes. Okay. So,
I'll be happy to share with you. If your viewers are looking at it, the pink and orange areas over to the left are two current boroughs of New York City. The pink is Brooklyn, and the orange is Queens. And the green is Nassau County. And Nassau County was a part of Queens up until the 1890s. And then all the way to the right is Suffolk County, which is the largest in land mass. And that county has been one of the original three. So Brooklyn is the county of kings. Queens is not only the borough of Queens, but is also the county of Queens. Nassau was originally part of Queens, and Suffolk has always been part of Long Island.
You know, Joe, I would like to ask you, so from those times when natives, you know, were running the governments and everything, they controlled the land, when did it become Long Island? When did it get these names?
Well, it became Long Island after the British took over from the Dutch, and when New Amsterdam was no longer New Amsterdam, it became New York, was renamed. So there was a whole Dutch settlement first. So Long Island, the name appears on some maps, and I think it was not necessarily named Long Island. It was just, it's a Long Island. And so
pretty Long Island.
Yeah. So so at some point it became Long Island, but prior to that it had different names. The Dutch had named it, the natives had named it, and it's arguable.
So who were the first settlers? First European settlers?
The first permanent settlers. The first group that came here and really were established were the Dutch.
Okay.
They came from the Dutch East India Company. As you know, the Dutch and Columbus thought that they had come to India. And they found out they didn't. So they called this area the East Indies as opposed to the West Indies. Or maybe I have that backwards, so I apologize if I'm mixing up my East and West. But anyway, it was a company that owned it. It wasn't the Dutch government. It was a company. And the company had settled here, and they established a fort, and they had established a community. If you are in Manhattan and you're familiar with a street called Wall Street, that was the original wall of the city. And so that was the earliest. But settlers, the Dutch settlers went as far east on Long Island as what is Nassau County. So if we could look at that map one more time, I'll just show you, is that the Dutch settlement went in what's the pink, the orange, and the green. And roughly the border between what is today's Nassau County and today's Suffolk County was really an area of demarcation. The Dutch did not really go much further east. There are some indications of Dutch families being in the Huntington area, but basically what was considered New Amsterdam and the Dutch settlement was in the pink, the orange, the green, and of course Manhattan Island, which is New York City. And for your viewers, Manhattan is an island that's to the left of the pink and the orange.
So when you say the Dutch restricted themselves to the western side and they did not go to the eastern, so was that eastern side taken over by the British or it was still with the natives?
Well, not initially. It really has a lot to do with how many people were here settling, and they kept moving further east. Ultimately, if you're looking at the map, you can see a gray, a shaded area on the other side, just north of Suffolk County. And so you see Long Island Sound, and then what's north of it is the state of Connecticut. And Connecticut is where in the mid-1600s, many people have heard of the Pilgrims who came to Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts, and that's why we have Thanksgiving here in this country. Well, their second generation started to move into Connecticut. There were people who broke away from the original Puritan community, and they came to Connecticut. And so the British would, these British settlers, at some point recognized that Connecticut was very rocky and that they would do well to bring their cows and sheep to the grassy pastures on Long Island. So they would come across from Connecticut to Long Island, and they started to settle in Suffolk County, which is the yellow area.
So, Joe, one thing I missed, when the natives were here, primarily, were they doing agriculture? Were they catching fishes? Or what was...
The Native Americans
Yes.
or the early settlers?
The Native Americans.
The Native Americans, how they survived, it was, well, the ones on Long Island were a little bit more migratory. By that I mean they were very gentle to the land. They didn't build, you know, pyramids like the natives in Mexico or Peru. They were very gentle. They would live on the beach in the summer, and then they would move further inland in the winter. So they weren't building cities. They just dwelled in a particular area, and they made their living by trading, because they were part of the Confederation, the Lenape Confederation. Obviously, they used seashells as their currency. So that was from here, and there's records of seashells from the Long Island area in other parts of the mainland of the United States. So we know the Lenapes were trading with these folks. But there was fishing, shell fishing. They weren't farmers necessarily, but they were traders, and they would trade, and you know, furs was not something here. They would trade for furs, you know, in order to stay warm in the winter.
And when the European settlers came, did they bring new industry? Did they bring agriculture? What changes?
So,
changed?
you know, Europeans have, they were agrarian, and they were also business people. So the Dutch in New Amsterdam, they were shipping and they traded. You know, if you're looking at the map, you can see from New York City, you could go north into New York State up the Hudson River. I think if your viewers are looking at the map, they can see a river that goes up to the left of side of the map there, and it goes up and down. And that the Hudson River was a great way for them to trade for furs with other Lenape and the Iroquois, who are further north, those nations. And so that the Dutch would be trading for furs, and a famous family in America and Europe is the Astor family, and the first Astor, that's what he was. He was a fur trader, beaver especially, since beaver fur was basically what they used for making hats. And coats, and the Europeans had exploited the beaver population in Europe so much, but so they depended on beaver from the Americas, and so New York was one of those ports, and the Dutch were happy to ship beaver fur to England and Holland.
And we learned that the most of the land that the European settlers bought from these natives was for exchange of fur coats. Is that right?
Yes. Well, they weren't prepared for the winters here. And so yes, there was they definitely needed furs. And coats. Yeah. And that was the start.
You have 3 current day towns for 4 coats.
Right.
Yeah.
But the Dutch started to settle, and they started to farm. So you were asking what they did, and so there's a photo I'd like to show you of a Dutch house. This is the family was called Skank. They spell it Schenck. This photo is taken from that house, which was built on Long Island and still exists. It's in a museum now called the Old Bethpage Restored Village, and it's one of the oldest houses on Long Island.
This house still exists?
Yes, it's in Old Bethpage, Long Island.
Awesome.
It's a community that the Nassau County decided to save some of its houses. Historic houses, and so that's a perfect example of a Dutch home.
Joe, time for a short break.
Okay.
When we come back, we will talk more about these settlers. ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟੀ ਜੀ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ The Way Forward। The Way Forward ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। So Joe, before going to the break, you showed us a house which is an early Dutch house.
Yep.
When do you think is this house constructed?
It was in the early 1600s. So
1600s.
It's one of the oldest houses in the New York area. So, there are older houses, but that's one of the oldest.
Okay. And that's representative of the way the Dutch people had their houses. The other settlers at that time were the British, right?
Yeah, so the British were settling in what is Suffolk County. But in addition to that, at some point, the British took over New Amsterdam. The Dutch gave up running New Amsterdam, and they gave it to the British, and New Amsterdam became New York. And so the British then also started moving into Queens and the other parts of New Amsterdam.
Was there a war or something to take over? Or
No, it was sort of a gentle, like a business deal. But what was great was I mentioned how the New England settlers were coming across, but now once the British had taken over New York, they came directly from England as well. But I wanted to show you a house of an early settler. It's Raynham Hall. It's a famous house on Long Island in Oyster Bay. And, it has a history to it. It's a very old house, and the family that lived there had been there for a long time. They were one of the first English settlers on Long Island. And the Oyster Bay is very close to that border between New Amsterdam and Suffolk County. And so they were one of the first to come here. And the house has some history because it was part of the Culper Spy Ring, which is George Washington's spy ring. And this is where they found out that Benedict Arnold had betrayed the United States. And so that's how they were able to catch him, was because the spies who lived in this house had found out about it. So
the spies lived in that house, or Benedict lived in this house?
the spies lived in the house.
Lived in that
The
house.
family, very quickly, the first battle of the American Revolution was the Battle of Long Island. So almost immediately, the people who lived on Long Island were dominated by the British. And so the British at that time would billet their officers in the homes of wealthy Long Islanders. And so this family were subject to having to host the officers, the British officers. And so they heard things from them, and they were part of a spy ring, and they were able to communicate to the spy ring and back to George Washington that Benedict Arnold was going to betray them. So,
it's very interesting. There's always a debate that on the island, were there more loyalists towards the British crown, or were there more what we call as patriots who were fighting them?
Well, I think there were definitely loyalists. There's no question of that, and there were. But the fact is that it was so early in the war that the Long Islanders were now subjected to the British, that if you were a loyalist, if you were a loyalist to the British Crown, you were able to. It wasn't an issue because you had to be. You were dominated by the British, and so it wasn't the same impact as other parts of the country.
We spoke about the British settlers coming in. So when the British took over from the Dutch, do we see any change in architecture or any visible features?
Sure. But first, I'd like to tell you another quick story before we talk about a change in architecture.
Yeah.
There's a house I want to show you that belonged to William Floyd, and he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And this house is in Mastic, Long Island. And William Floyd was his family had gotten a land grant from the British Crown, and they had a plantation, and their plantation included enslaved natives as well as black slaves from Africa. So they what's interesting is that there is a native population that still lives in that area, and that population is a tribe that has not yet been recognized by the federal government. And so after all these years, you can argue how many tribes were on Long Island because the federal government hasn't always recognized all of them. And but they still live on a reservation in that area. But this gentleman was this is a perfect example of a house that grew over the years. This was not the size of the house at the time that he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. But the original house is the portion to our right when you're looking at it. And so you can see the English style had started to take over. You can see the portion of the house to the right is called, commonly in this country, we refer to it as a Cape Cod, even though it's not necessarily just from Cape Cod. And then the rest of the house was built. By the way, the rest of the house that you are looking at was the way the house was when two young men, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, had come to visit here. So
they came and visited this house?
And they eventually became presidents of the United States.
I want to visit that as well.
Anyway.
Joe, you spoke about slavery. A lot of people have this impression that slavery is a southern thing. Can you talk about a little about slavery on Long Island?
Sure. Slavery was very definitely part of the Long Island community. Slaves are an important part of the economy that the British had brought here. Of course, as years went on, slavery was disbanded, and New York, and especially Long Island, had many people who protested slavery. So there was a reaction here, but certainly slavery was part of what happened here. There's a great story. There was a movie made called Amistad. It was about a slave ship, where there was a mutiny, and the mutiny took place, and the ship ran aground off of the coast of Long Island. And so when these slaves found their freedom, the Long Islanders gathered them up, and they were imprisoned.
I know I've seen this one Sylvester Manor on the Shelter Island in Long Island, where these slaves were initially brought.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, there are. There are many different plantations. The one I showed you, the William Floyd, is one example. But on Shelter Island, there were quite a few. The slavery was common throughout the island.
But it was abolished before the rest of the country. I guess it was abolished around 1827 in New York.
Yes.
And rest of the country.
Yes, absolutely.
But
we were going to talk a second ago about the transformation of the architecture, and
from the Dutch to the British.
Right. So there's a house I want to show you that is really a blend of a Dutch and a British colonial. Oh, well, that's not quite the right photo, but it's okay. So anyway, there were at one point they started to blend the two different roof styles, and so the British took on some of the Dutch elements, and there was a blended look. And so we won't show you that photo.
We lost that photo. So we've reached around the time which we call the Federalist period in United States, right? Around 1780s and all that. I believe we had at least two founding fathers from New York who signed the Declaration of Independence. Right. They were
Francis Lewis
yes.
and William Floyd.
William Floyd. So can you tell us more about the politics of New York at that time?
Well, they're probably like the politics
rest of the
anytime. Yeah, there were people, a lot of people who didn't agree with each other, and one thing that was clear was that once the government had started and we had a new government, there was a real excitement among all the people, but people didn't necessarily agree with how we should run the country. But religion became an important part. And on Long Island, here's that house I'll just share with you. I just want to show you the roof. And the roof line is a combination of Dutch, and then the front of the house is definitely British and in the look.
But this still looks like a lot of houses we see on the island still.
Sure, well, it's an architectural influence that continues. But and then I wanted to show you, there's a church, a photo of a church here on Long Island. This is an example of the Greek revival architecture. That was an example of the exuberance that people had in the new republic. We were a new country, and people thought that classic Greece was a perfect example of the new dynamism, and they wanted to get away from the Georgian style of architecture, which after all was British and was named after the King George. So this was something classically United States. And so while we talked about a little bit about politics, religion was playing a big role, and Christianity was a big part of it.
We will talk more about that after a short break. ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ The Way Forward. The Way Forward is ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। So Joe, we have been talking about different people on the island. We talk about natives, and then the Dutch, and then the British. Around this time, more immigrants start
Sure.
coming onto the land. Who else? Who were the first groups to arrive?
Sure, the new republic was started and was open. They were looking for more people to come here. So the first group actually had started migrating here prior to the American Revolution, and they were the German-speaking people. And then once the new republic had started, Irish and Scottish Irish started to come. So a good portion of Scottish Irish were coming. The distinction is Scottish Irish are Protestant in general, and Calvinist, and non-Scottish Irish are generally Catholic. And so the religion had a big play, and so Protestantism was more of an attraction. But Germans were coming here as well, and Germans settled throughout Long Island, and we still have very large German communities and settlements on Long Island, as well as Irish. So they were the first two big groups that came here. Later, of course, other populations came, but prior to the Civil War, this whole federal period, this era of growth and dynamism on Long Island and in the country, the biggest populations were German speakers and the Irish.
Did natives and the freed slaves, did they have a role in the society as well?
Well, not too many natives. For the most part, natives were gone by 1670. And so those who stayed here were kind of enslaved or were disenfranchised, or had intermingled or assimilated with the slave, the African slaves. The Germans became craftsmen. They were cabinet makers, furniture makers, builders, and construction. And so there's a photo I'd like to show you of village life started to expand on Long Island. This is an example of a village. At that time, you could see there would be an inn, a general store, a blacksmith shop, which those are. And that's pretty much what how a community would look at that particular period. Once again, that happens to be Old Bethpage Restored Village in Old Bethpage, Long Island. And those are real buildings from Long Island from that era, and representing the dynamic era of growth in this country before the Civil War. Germans were really responsible for much of the tool making, cabinet making, furniture making, construction, and so there was a new style of lifestyle that was happening, and shipbuilding. So they were very active in those, and the Irish pretty much were they were looked down upon actually, and they were relegated. Women were relegated to being housekeepers and washerwomen.
So Joe, this we hear that when the Irish came, there was a lot of repulsion that was shown to them. They were not very welcome. So is that around this period, or this is some later times you're talking?
Both. The Irish were definitely here later, right prior to the Civil War in this country, of course. There was the famine, and a lot of Irish were coming then. And you may be familiar with a movie called 5 Points. I think it was called 5 Points, but it takes place in 5 Points in New York City. The Irish had a lot of gangs. They worked on the docks. They were the ones who would offload the ships.
So we know this recent one, the Gangs of New York.
Gangs of New York, that's
Yes.
the name of the movie. And so that was pretty much what happened. And leading up into the Civil War, we know there were lots of New York-based Irish and Long Island-based Irish, because there was the draft riots, and there were many people killed. And what happened was Abraham Lincoln had decided to, he needed more men in the army, and so he created the first draft in the United States. And so many wealthy people were able to buy their way out by paying an Irishman to take their place.
Okay.
So all these immigrants who weren't even given U.S. citizenship were being forced to go and fight in the American Civil War for the freedom of slaves, when in fact they were being treated pretty much the same way the African slaves were being treated. So it wasn't they weren't exactly exuberantly happy about the draft. So the Irish were very dominant in our culture at that time, and on Long Island were the laborers, and many of the homes on Long Island had Irish maids, and that was a pretty common experience. But they were the they were the lowest in society.
We're talking about people from that era. One term that we hear is a knickerbocker.
A term, knickerbocker, sure.
Yeah. What does that refer to?
Well, knickerbocker, that's a clothing style, and it was a style that you may, if you've ever seen a portrait of George Washington, he's wearing knickers. These are pants that came right below your knee, and you wore knee socks, woolen socks to cover your calves. The fact is that the Dutch, the old Dutch from New Amsterdam days, as they got older and there were new generations, the Dutch held on to that culture, and they kept wearing knickerbockers or knickers long after they were out of style and out of fashion. And some people made fun of them. But as time went on, the old Dutch society in New York became the elite society, and they were referred to as knickerbockers. And in fact, Mrs. Astor was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, and she developed the New York society, the 400, and so life surrounded in New York when it came to high society around Mrs. Astor's decision of who fit into that, and that was called the Knickerbocker Society. And it wasn't until after the Civil War and the dawn of the Gilded Age that the Knickerbocker Society started to dissolve in their influence, because other people became wealthy and were also demanding to be part of that society. But you can watch the Netflix series called The Gilded Age to get more of a hint of that storyline.
Joe promised us to stay here for another episode because we need to talk about that Gilded Age that he just mentioned. We want to talk about the development of society, the development of Long Island, right from that a period when it starts with natives, and then the first settlers come, right till today, 2022. That will need some more time, but we have gotten some very basic idea, very nice idea of who were living on the island at that time. There were no South Asians at that time, right?
No, South Asians came. You folks came a little bit later.
Okay. Were there any Jewish people?
There were Jewish people from the very beginning when the Dutch were settled here. There was a large Sephardic Jewish community, and so yes, Jews have been here in the New York area, but didn't make them necessarily welcome. Let's be honest. Life was not easy for people who were not Calvinist or Church of England. So yes, and then later, of course, we had more Jews coming and more and people from Italy and from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. And
life was not very easy for Catholics as well. Is it right?
No, they're essentially there really was no Catholic community on Long Island until much later. And we're talking about, there was still Ku Klux Klan protests against Catholics in the 1920s. So, it was Long Island was not particularly open and welcoming to Catholics. It was a society that truly wanted to remain a non-Catholic, a non-papist, and focus on Calvinism, and Church of England tended to be the most popular. There was pushback on Quakers, but there was definitely a significant Quaker community here on Long Island, and still is. But the Quakers were not necessarily very welcome, but people came here anyway.
ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਜੋ ਤੂੰ ਥੋੜਾ ਸਮਝਿਆ ਕਿ ਕੌਣ ਲੋਕੀ ਇਸ ਲੌਂਗ ਆਈਲੈਂਡ ਤੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ 1870s 1880s ਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਜਿਸ ਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਰੀਕਨਸਟਰਕਸ਼ਨ ਦਾ ਪੀਰੀਅਡ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਜਦ ਸਲੇਵਰੀ ਖਤਮ ਹੋ ਗਈ ਬੜੀ ਤਰੱਕੀ ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਨੇ ਵੇਖੀ ਉਸ ਟਾਈਮ ਵਿੱਚ ਗਿਲਡਡ ਏਜ ਕਿਹਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ ਅਰਾਊਂਡ 1890s ਔਰ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਨਿਊਯਾਰਕ ਦੀ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਡਿਵੈਲਪ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਕੀ ਉਹ ਇੰਡਸਟਰੀਜ਼ ਸਨ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਤਰੱਕੀ ਕੌਜ਼ ਕੀਤੀ ਔਰ ਨਵੀਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇੰਡਸਟਰੀਜ਼ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆਈਆਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਸਾਰੀ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਜੋ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਅਗਲੇ ਐਪੀਸੋਡ ਵਿੱਚ ਅੱਜ ਸਾਡਾ ਸ਼ੋਅ ਵੇਖਣ ਦਾ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ ਜੋ thank you so much for taking on the time and I hope you'll give us another episode taking this conversation further right up till 2022.
Sure, this is fun. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.